Hey guys, it's Eamon. Welcome back to another video. So the World Chess Championship is taking place right now in Singapore between Ding Liren and Bhupesh Damaraju. And as of recording this, they've played 6 games and the score is tied. But in the first game, Ding Liren shocked the chess world when he played the French defense with the black pieces, and he won that game. Now, the French defense has been played in a lot of World Championship matches. There have been 40 games, but the black pieces don't score too well in it. There have been 18 white wins, 19 draws, and only 3 black wins. And today I want to take a look at the last time the player with the black pieces won with the French defense, and that was in 1954, over 70 years ago, between Vassily Smyslov and Mikhail Botvinnik. So this was also game one of their match. And of course, it's a French defense, so we open with e4 and e6. Now, Botvinnik played the French defense very effectively throughout his career, and it really suited his style because he believed thoroughly in deep opening preparation and in fully understanding all the positional complexities involved in an opening. So we have d4, d5, knight c3, and bishop b4. So this was by far Botvinnik's favorite answer to knight c3. Knight f6 is also possible, but Botvinnik almost never played this. He almost always went for bishop b4. Now e5 is the critical test, taking the space advantage, and c5, so striking black back at that center. And now a3 is the main line, and in this game, Botvinnik plays bishop a5. He also in his career played bishop takes c3, which is much more popular and results in a very sharp game. But after bishop a5, now Alekhine first came up with this move, b4, and this is a good antidote to this bishop a5 move. It looks like it just sacks a pawn, but the point is that if black gets greedy and tries to take this pawn, then knight b5, threatening to come into d6, and then even though black can play b takes a3 check, after c3, white is just much better, even though he's down a pawn, because knight d6 is a threat, and bishop takes a3 is gonna win back a pawn, and white has very good development here. So instead, after b4, Botvinnik takes on d4, and in this game, game one, Smyslov went knight b5. Later on in the match, in game 9, he played queen g4 and went on to win a pretty nice game. But in this first game, he stuck with knight b5. So knight d6 is a pretty big threat, so the bishop drops back to c7. And now f4, reinforcing this e5 pawn. And from here we get some pretty standard development. So knight e7, knight f3, knight bc6, bishop d3, and bishop b8. So Botvinnik's plan is clear. He wants to play a6, and then this bishop is going to pop out to this diagonal, where it's going to look pretty good. Now knight takes on d4 and a6. So Botvinnik carrying on with his plan. Bishop e3, bishop a7, and castles. So we've got a pretty level position. White, of course, does have this space advantage, so he could have some claim to an advantage. But black is going to get counterplay on the c file, which we're going to see quickly. So knight takes d4, bishop takes, and we get an exchange of minor pieces, and queen b6. So queen b6 pins the knight, but this knight isn't in too much danger. Smyslov just plays king h1, and of course, the knight is not actually hanging here because of this very famous French tactic with bishop b5 check, winning the queen. So instead of taking the knight, Botvinnik goes bishop d7, and now the knight is under attack because queen takes d4. There's no bishop b5 with check. So therefore c3. So c3 is the best move here, reinforcing the knight on its strong central square. But this is a backwards pawn, and from here, most of black's play in the middle game is going to focus around trying to target this weak pawn on c3. So rook c8 and queen e1. So the queen comes to e1 to defend the pawn, and it might have some ideas of popping out to g3 to hit this pawn, or even to h4 to try to target h7 if black castles. And now Botvinnik plays h6, which is not the best move. Of course, it does prevent threats against h7 in the future, but it's pretty slow. The best move here was bishop b5, trying to exchange off this classically bad bishop in the French. And even though white can play takes and leave black with these double isolated pawns, this is actually pretty good for black because even though this pawn is weak, it's no weaker than this pawn on c3. And meanwhile, this pawn on b5 prevents black from advancing with either c4 or a4. So this position would be about equal. Instead, he went for h6, like I said, a slow move. And now Smyslov goes for a4, preventing this idea of bishop b5. A4 also could introduce some ideas of a5, immobilizing black's center, or sorry, immobilizing black's queenside pawns here. So a5 could be a positional threat. So because of that, Botvinnik himself plays a5. And now knight b3 pressures this a5 pawn. And instead of exchanging or trying to defend that pawn, Botvinnik counterattacks this c3 pawn. Now knight c5. So the knight plugs the c file, so this pawn is no longer under attack. But the knight, even though this is an outpost, it's not a super stable outpost because at some point black might be able to play b6 and kick the knight back. Bishop c6, queen f2. So potentially supporting the knight and potentially looking to play queen c5 in some variations. So castles, knight comes back to b3, again hitting the pawn. And again, instead of trying to defend that pawn or trying to take on b4 and relieve white of his weakness on c3, Botvinnik drops the bishop back, again counterattacking on c3, and queen c5. So this basically forces the queens off. Queen takes c5. And here's an interesting moment. Smyslov took with the knight, which is fine, but actually the best move was to take with the b pawn. It looks super unnatural to leave yourself with these double isolated c pawns, and it looks like the c pawn is going to be a long-term liability because the knight always has to protect the c pawn, as well as this a pawn always has to be protected by the rook. But this was in fact the best way to play, and the reason is that it basically just closes off the queen side. And black, since black has no way to target this knight, you can see none of black's pieces here are going to be able to target this knight on b3. The pawn on c5 is actually not weak at all. It's actually quite a strength because it plugs the c file. Black has no more play here as long as this knight is on b3. And in the meantime, white could go for a plan like king to g1 and then walking his king up to the middle here. So this was hopefully the most ambitious way to play. But Smyslov goes for knight takes c5, which looks much more natural. But now after rook c7, again, this c pawn is a liability because black could be threatening to go b6 and try to target that pawn. So Smyslov immediately exchanges, takes, and he takes on a5. Now, of course, this pawn can't survive for very long. Rook a8 seeks to gain pawn back. There's no way to defend that pawn, so Smyslov plays a6, trying to leave black with a weakness of his own. Takes, and now c4. And c4 looks quite natural. Of course, when one side has a bishop versus a knight, when that imbalance exists, often the bishop prefers a more open position. But another piece that loves an open position is the rooks. And the thing is here, black's rooks are actually in a much better position to exploit an open position than white's rooks, which are stuck passively at the moment. So takes, bishop takes, and now rook d4. And we can see this rook looks quite good in the middle of the board. And if this rook can ever activate and reach the 7th rank, or the 2nd rank in this case, then the black rooks are going to be very active. So the bishop drops back. Of course, black's one problem is this pawn on a6. And A5 is definitely a logical positional move for both sides, in fact, to play. But neither player wanted to commit with A5. So first knight D5, attacking this F4 pawn. G3 protects. And this would have been a quite logical time to play A5 and fix this pawn on a dark square and not allow his own pawn to become fixed on a light square. But instead, Botvinnik goes for knight C3. So trying to maneuver this knight into a better square. Bishop F3 hits the rook. So rook B8. And now we can see the rooks are looking quite good. If they could ever reach the second rank here, that would be devastating. And at the moment, the knight is doing a good job controlling the squares where the white rooks could contest those open files. So because of that, Botvinnik goes for rook a3, kicking the knight. Now knight b1 hits the rook. The rook drops back. Knight d2 gains another tempo on the rook on f1. So the rook comes to f2. And knight c4. So this is a pretty good square for the knight. It looks at a5, which could be relevant in some positions. It also looks at e5, which could be a weakness if black is ever able to play g5 and undermine this e5 point. So now Smyslov goes for h4. And the idea of h4, if for example in this position black were to play a5, now white would get to play h5 and clamp down on this g5 break. So because of that, Botvinnik, seeing that h5 is coming, he immediately goes for g5. It was a great move. This does two things. First of all, it undermines this e5 pawn, and it also creates another square for the king to come up. A square, importantly, it creates left on the dark squares so that the king could come up and enter the game. And here, Smyslov exchanges. Now a very surprising move to me. He takes on h5, on g5. To me, it seems much more natural to try to keep this e5 pawn protected and play a move like bishop e2, trying to exchange off this powerful knight on c4. And the knight can't avoid being exchanged off because if it moves, then this a6 pawn is going to hang. So for example, if a5 here, then we could see an exchange of minor pieces, and black is still slightly better here with his active rooks, but should be pretty easy for white to hold. But instead, Smyslov takes on g5, and knight takes e5. So material is level again, and we see white has these potentially weak pawns on the g file. Bishop e2, and rook check, the king comes up, and finally a5. Cements this pawn in place, and it's not going to be fixed on a light square. Rook c2, bringing the rook to the open file. And rook b3, so some maneuvering going on here. Rook f4. Of course, we don't want to exchange rooks and fix white's pawn structure. This would be not at all ideal, so instead the rook drops back to d5, which is a great square for the rook. It protects a5, and it could potentially attack this g5 pawn. Rook e4, the king comes up, bishop h5. So bishop h5 seeks to prevent the king from coming up to g6 to attack this g pawn. Now knight g6. So knight g6 does attack this pawn. And of course, white doesn't want to immediately take here because then this g pawn is very weak. So instead of taking the knight, Smyslov goes rook g4, defending. Now rook e3. So the idea of rook e3 is to play this rook to e5, again to try to target this g pawn. So now Smyslov takes. Of course, king takes, attacking this pawn. And Smyslov goes for his only chance here, rook f2. So, of course, now if this pawn is taken, then the f pawn will fall. And this is an equal position. So instead of immediately taking the g5 pawn, Smyslov goes rook f5, which is a great practical try. Now rook takes is forced. And here's an interesting moment. The computer recommends king takes f5, And it says the game is basically level. After check, another check. If black now tries to take this pawn, the f7 pawn is going to fall. And even though black can win this a4 pawn, this should be a fairly simple draw for white because his g pawn is going to give him enough counterplay, and the and these pawns aren't dangerous enough. So this should be a fairly easy draw for white. But so the computer prefers king takes f5, and it says either option is basically a draw. But e takes f5 is the much more human move because it forces white to find some only moves to defend the endgame. Rook c4 is a good start, and rook e4. So the rook challenges along the fourth rank. Of course, this would be a losing pawn endgame because this g4, g5 pawn will fall, and then white will have a protected pass pawn here. So after rook c4, rook e4, the rook has to move away. Rook c7. So the rook wants to keep an eye on this f7 pawn, so that if king takes g5, he can win the pawn on f7. So of course, the a pawn falls, and now comes the critical moment of the game. Smyslov played rook a7, which is a losing move. But it's not easy to figure out why. Of course, it seems like quite a natural move, putting the rook behind the pawn. And now there's only one winning move for black. If you like, pause your video and try to find the winning move for black. So the winning move is rook a3, which Botvinnik found. And the point is to try to prevent king f3. And king f3 would have been the drawing move on the last move. So if we go back, here the only drawing move was king f3. All other moves lose for white. And the point is that the king is going to be able to come up to f4 and either protect this g5 pawn or attack this f5 pawn. And if we look at some variations here, we could try rook e4, but after rook a7, a4, basically the king is just active enough to where he can, black can't make much progress uh, without losing his f5 pawn. For example, if he tries to play a3 here, then rook a6, and black is going to lose this f5 pawn, and this is an easy draw. So So that's why rook a7 was a blunder, king f3 was a drawing move. And great prophylaxis here from Botvinnik. He realizes that king f3 is a drawing idea, and that's why rook a3 is the only winning move, preventing the king from coming up. Now Smyslov plays king h3, which looks like suicide because it walks into f4. But in fact, no matter what he does, he's losing. If he tries king f2, then now Botvinnik can play a4, and if the king just waits, now the rook can come back to a1, and the king doesn't reach f4 in time. So if king f2, now you can just play, sorry, whoops, let's go back. So if, uh, right, so you play king a3, if king f2, a4, and if the king tries to come up, now we can just play a3. Even if the king tries to come up to f4 here, we can just play a2. And the point is, even though uh, white can win this f5 pawn, it doesn't matter because rook f1 is, of course, a winning move here and the pawn will promote. So that one tempo made all the difference. Rook a3 and f4. So the king instead of going to f2 comes out to h3, allowing f4. But now this pawn can just be taken. And after rook a6 check, now the king can come up and king comes back. So now g2 is a threat. So there was no time to take this f7 pawn. So the king comes back to h3 to try to stop g2. But now rook f3 protects this f7 pawn. And after rook a6, rook f5 was the final move of the game. Black is up two clean pawns, and there's no way to win either of these pawns. If king takes on g3, then rook takes g5, and one of these pawns is going to go through. All right, so that was the last time the French defense was used successfully in a World Chess Championship match. Thank you guys for watching the video. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I hope you continue to enjoy the rest of this exciting World Championship match that's going on right now between Gukesh and Ding Liren. Thanks so much for watching.